What would have beaten you faster? It was a simple question, asked in the quiet, sterile confines of a prisoner of war camp in 1946, when the renowned British military historian B.H. Liddell Hart posed this query to the captured elite of the German High Command. He expected a technical, perhaps dry, military answer. He anticipated a discussion about industrial output, the overwhelming crushing weight of air superiority, or the intricate mathematics of logistics. He did not expect an indictment. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic Prussian and senior German commander in the West, looked at the historian with weary, knowing eyes. He did not speak of bombers or factories. Instead, he described a strategic gift the Allies had unwittingly hand-delivered to the Third Reich in September 1944. It was a gift wrapped in hesitation and tied with a ribbon of political compromise. A gift that ultimately cost tens of thousands of American lives and extended the most horrific war in human history by 6 agonizing months. As Liddell Hart listened, scribbling furiously, he realized he wasn't merely hearing a critique of a map or a tactical error. He was hearing a tragedy. He was hearing that the silence of the guns, which the world prayed for, could have started 6 months earlier. Every grave dug between September 1944 and May 1945 suddenly felt less like a necessity of war and more like a terrifying choice. The Germans knew they were defeated that autumn. Their army was broken, their morale shattered. The road to Berlin lay wide open, beckoning. They were waiting for the finishing blow, but because of a fatal political compromise within the Allied High Command, that blow never came. To understand this tragedy, we must rewind to late August 1944. The German army in France was not merely retreating, it was undergoing a total, catastrophic disintegration. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket had been an absolute slaughterhouse. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions for the Wehrmacht. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured, marching into captivity with their hands on their heads. Tens of thousands more lay dead in the fields of Normandy. Equipment losses were absolute and unrecoverable. Tanks, artillery pieces, and transport vehicles littered the roads for miles, twisted metal skeletons burning under the French sun. Into this chaos stepped Field Marshal Walter Model, arriving to take command of the Western Front. Known as Hitler's fireman, Model was the troubleshooter sent to fix every disaster, the man who could squeeze water from a stone. But what Model found upon his arrival made his stomach turn. He did not find an army, he found fragments of units, ghosts of divisions. He found soldiers without weapons, officers without men, and a command structure that had evaporated. The defensive line existed on paper only. In reality, Model's entire force across the immense front had roughly 100 operational tanks. The rest were broken down, abandoned, or out of fuel. Facing him, the Allies had 12 full armored divisions, engines idling, ready to attack. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, the forge that built their Tigers and Panthers, lay virtually undefended. Model, for all his tactical genius, had absolutely nothing to stop a concentrated thrust. For 3 critical weeks in September 1944, the gates to Germany were unlatched. Germany was defenseless. Allied intelligence knew it. General George S. Patton's Third Army knew it. The soldiers racing across France, breathless and exhilarated, could feel it in the air. German resistance was collapsing faster than the Allies could advance. The GIs in the Third Army weren't just moving, they were flying across the map. For the first time since the blood-soaked beaches of D-Day, they could smell the end. There was a giddy, intoxicating belief among the ranks that they would be home by Thanksgiving, eating turkey with their families. They didn't know that the brakes were already being pulled, not by the enemy, but from a desk hundreds of miles away. Patton had reached the Moselle River. It was the last major water barrier before the Siegfried Line, the legendary West Wall protecting the German border. His tanks were a mere 100 miles from the Reich. The path to the Rhine was open. The path beyond was open. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, delivered assessment after assessment, each more urgent than the last. The Germans are finished, their army is broken. One concentrated push, one violent shove, would end it all. On the other side, Model was desperately scraping together whatever human debris he could find to plug the gaping holes. He was mobilizing old men from reserve units, suffering from WWI injuries. He was calling up teenagers from the Hitler Youth, boys whose helmets were too big for their heads. He was pulling rear echelon clerks, cooks, and mechanics who had never fired a rifle in combat. He was building a defensive line out of desperation and prayer. Every day the Allies delayed, Model got stronger. Every week of hesitation gave him more time to rebuild the shattered Wehrmacht. The window of opportunity was closing with a deafening creak. On September 1st, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground forces. He stood at a crossroads that would determine how the war ended and how many more would die. He faced a monumental strategic decision: concentrate everything on one axis, a narrow front, and punch through to the Ruhr with overwhelming force. Or advance on multiple fronts simultaneously, a broad front, and squeeze Germany from all directions. The concentrated thrust was the aggressive option. It was the gambler's move. You pick your best commander, you give him every drop of gas, every bullet, every truck, and you let him run until he hits Berlin. High risk, high reward. If it worked, the Nazi regime collapses in weeks. If it failed, if that single thrust was cut off, you've bet everything on one card. Patton wanted it. American military doctrine supported it. The reality of the German defenses screamed for it. But Eisenhower wasn't just a general, he was the chairman of the board. He was managing a fractured, ego-driven alliance. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British hero, demanded priority in the north. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was pressuring President Roosevelt to give British forces a larger role to ensure Britain's standing in the post-war world. Montgomery, arrogant and abrasive, threatened to go over Eisenhower's head to Churchill if he didn't receive priority. The resulting political crisis could have fractured the alliance at its most critical moment. Furthermore, Patton was politically toxic. The infamous slapping incidents in Sicily had made him a pariah in the press and impossible to promote publicly. Giving him supreme operational authority, despite his brilliance, would have caused an uproar in Washington and London. Eisenhower was trapped between military logic and political reality. There was also a severe logistical problem. The Allies had captured Antwerp on September 4th, one of Europe's largest ports. It was the solution to their supply crisis. But there was a catch. German forces still controlled the Scheldt estuary leading to the port. Until the estuary was cleared of mines and guns, the port was useless. Clearing the Scheldt was Montgomery's responsibility, but he was distracted, his eyes fixed on a different prize: Operation Market Garden. The broad front strategy meant advancing slowly across the whole line, without a frontline supply port, stretching resources thin. Eisenhower chose the broad front. He chose it not because he couldn't read a map, but because he understood the politics of coalition warfare. It was the tax paid to keep the British and Americans marching together. Consequently, Patton's Third Army ground to a halt in the first week of September. It wasn't stopped by German panzers, it wasn't stopped by artillery, it was stopped by empty fuel tanks. The Allied supply system was breaking down. Trucks from the Red Ball Express simply couldn't move fuel fast enough from the distant Normandy beaches to the front lines. Every army was running short, and when Eisenhower had to choose who got the precious drops of gasoline, he chose Montgomery. Montgomery had seduced Eisenhower with a plan to end the war in one stroke: Operation Market Garden. It was an audacious, complicated airborne assault to capture a series of bridges across the Rhine in Holland. Montgomery promised it would end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower, desperate for a breakthrough, gave him priority for fuel, ammunition, and transport aircraft. American airborne divisions were placed under British command. The entire Allied Air Force was dedicated to supporting this single operation. Patton was furious. He was apoplectic. His army sat motionless, engines silent, while the path to Germany remained wide open. He told his staff with prophetic rage that they were handing the Germans exactly what they needed most: time. Market Garden launched on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation in history, a spectacle of air power. And it failed catastrophically. It was a bridge too far. The British 1st Airborne Division was dropped into a trap at Arnhem, surrounded by SS Panzer divisions that Allied intelligence claimed weren't there. They were cut to pieces. Of the 10,000 men who landed, barely 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Total Allied casualties exceeded 17,000. The dream of ending the war by Christmas died in the mud of Holland. As the shattered remnants of the 1st Airborne waded back across the Rhine, the true tragedy wasn't just the brave men lost in the woods of Arnhem. It was the fuel that wasn't in Patton's tanks. It was the momentum that had been gambled on a shortcut that led to a dead end. Patton had predicted exactly this. He had warned that stopping his advance to support a risky gamble in the north would let the Germans recover. He had begged, pleaded, and screamed for the fuel that went to Market Garden. Nobody had listened. The momentum had evaporated. Walter Model couldn't believe his luck. In the first week of September, he had nothing. A broken army, no reserves, no defensive line. He had reported to Hitler that the situation was hopeless without immediate reinforcement. Then, miraculously, the Allied advance slowed. It stopped in some sectors. The concentrated thrust he feared more than death never came. Model worked frantically. He pulled units from quiet sectors. He activated every reserve formation in Germany. He conscripted factory workers, handed them rifles, and pointed them west. Day by day, the West Wall, what the Allies called the Siegfried Line, came back to life. Bunkers that had been empty were now manned. Minefields were laid. Artillery was positioned. By late September, he had a defensive line. By October, he had reserves. By November, he was planning a counteroffensive. The Allies had given him 6 weeks. 6 weeks to rebuild an army from the wreckage. 6 weeks that should never have existed. Model knew exactly why he was still fighting. The enemy had spread their forces across a broad front instead of concentrating for a killing blow. It was a strategic gift of incalculable value. The war ground on through the bitter winter. Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. And then, the interrogations began. The individual testimonies Liddell Hart collected were damning, but the collective consensus was devastating. When he cross-referenced his interviews, a single, unifying sentence emerged. One that Allied politicians wished he had never written. Asterisk. All the German generals to whom I talked were of the opinion that the Allied Supreme Command had missed a great opportunity of ending the war in the autumn of 1944. Asterisk. Rundstedt was direct, his voice devoid of emotion but heavy with fact. He told Liddell Hart exactly what the Allies should have done. The best course, he said, would have been to concentrate a really strong striking force with which to break through past Aachen to the Ruhr area. Strategically and politically, Berlin was the target. Germany's strength is in the north. He who holds northern Germany holds Germany. Rundstedt paused, looking at the map in his mind, then delivered his conclusion. Such a breakthrough, coupled with air domination, would have torn in pieces the weak German front and forced Germany's collapse. This wasn't an excuse for losing. This was professional military analysis from the man who had commanded Germany's defense. He was explaining exactly how the Allies could have destroyed him faster, and he was explaining why they hadn't. Rundstedt wasn't alone in this assessment. General Blumentritt called the delay a gift. General Hasso von Manteuffel called the broad front strategy fundamentally wrong. Kurt Meyer, the fanatical SS Panzer commander, was the most blunt. He admitted that the backbone of German resistance was broken in September. They were just waiting for the Allies to notice, waiting for the hammer to fall. General after general, the verdict was the same. The Third Reich was given a second lease on life because the killing blow never came. Liddell Hart asked the obvious follow-up question, the one that history demanded. If a concentrated thrust was the answer, who should have led it? The Germans weren't advocating for Montgomery, despite his arguments for a northern thrust. They had found Montgomery predictable, methodical, plotting. You always knew what he would do next. He would not move until every shoelace was tied. General Omar Bradley was competent, but cautious. German commanders felt they could anticipate his movements and prepare defenses accordingly. But when asked about Patton, the assessment changed dramatically. Rundstedt reportedly told a Times Stars and Stripes Times reporter after his capture that Patton was their best. The American way of war speed, aggression, armored thrusts, relentless pressure, that was the formula that terrified German commanders. That was the chaos they couldn't plan for. That was what they said would have destroyed them. And that was exactly what coalition politics had suppressed. Patton had been right all along. The enemy confirmed it. Once the September window closed, the Allies faced months of fighting that German generals said was unnecessary. Consider the Hurtgen Forest. American forces spent 3 hellish months fighting through dense, dark woodland for terrain that offered no strategic value and could have been easily bypassed. It became known as the Green Hell. Tree bursts from artillery shredded men to pieces. It resulted in 33,000 casualties, one of the bloodiest battles of the European theater. While generals at Shahef debated coalition harmony in warm offices, 19-year-olds in the Hurtgen were rotting in frozen foxholes, fighting for every yard of a forest that didn't need to be taken. They were fighting against an enemy that should have already surrendered. Consider the Siegfried Line. It was eventually taken by bloody frontal assault, bunker by bunker, because it hadn't been outflanked when it was weak and unmanned. The battles ground on through autumn and into the freezing winter. American soldiers died, taking ground that should have been behind them months earlier. Every casualty had a name. Every death produced a telegram to a shattering family back home. German generals, interviewed in comfortable captivity, explained that it didn't have to happen this way. Then came December 16th, 1944. Germany launched its last major offensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. The attack succeeded initially because Eisenhower's broad front strategy had left defensive positions dangerously thin. There were no reserves where they were needed. The Germans achieved complete surprise. 80,000 American casualties in 6 weeks, 19,000 dead. The 106th Infantry Division surrendered 7,000 men, the largest mass surrender of American forces in the European theater. This offensive was the direct result of the delay. This was the offensive that Model had spent the autumn preparing. This was what the 6 weeks of September and October had bought Germany. Time to rebuild, time to plan, time to launch one final, desperate attack to kill more Americans. German generals didn't claim the Bulge would have succeeded regardless. They acknowledged it was only possible because the broad front gave them the breathing room to prepare it. A concentrated Allied thrust in September would have forced a German surrender before any counteroffensive was even a drawing on a map. Every handshake that kept a general happy meant the front line moved a little slower, the casualty lists grew a little longer. The Germans understood coalition politics better than the Allies realized. One captured officer told interrogators that the Allies were fighting two wars, one against Germany and one against each other. Germany only had to survive the second war long enough to rebuild for the first. Every time Montgomery and Patton competed for resources, Germany won time. Every time Eisenhower compromised to keep the coalition happy, German defensive lines grew stronger. Rundstedt recognized this. He had studied the Allied command structure. He knew that Eisenhower's job was as much political as it was military. He knew that concentration of force, the most basic principle of war, was politically impossible for the Allies, even when it was militarily obvious. The broad front wasn't a military strategy, it was a political necessity, and German generals understood that distinction perfectly. Historians still debate whether a concentrated thrust could have ended the war in 1944. They argue that supply lines were stretched, ports were damaged, and a single thrust might have outrun its logistics and been destroyed in isolation. These are valid points. But these arguments largely come from Allied planners who had reasons to justify their decisions and protect their reputations. The German commanders who actually faced those decisions had a different view. They were the ones looking at the empty fuel gauges and the unmanned bunkers. Model had nothing in September. The Ruhr was open. The Siegfried Line was a ghost town. A concentrated attack with everything available would have broken through before Germany could recover. The men who would have had to stop that attack said it couldn't be stopped. The enemy trying to destroy America understood Allied leadership better than Washington did. German generals saw what politicians refused to admit. Military speed mattered more than coalition harmony. Concentrated aggression beats dispersed caution. The commander who could win fastest wasn't the commander who got the resources. Eisenhower kept the alliance together. That was his job, and he did it magnificently. He managed egos that could fill a stadium, but keeping the alliance together wasn't the same as ending the war as fast as possible. History remembers Eisenhower as the man who won the war. German generals remembered him as the man who let them survive the autumn. There's a profound distinction between a commander who wins a war and a commander who ends one as fast as possible. You can find that distinction in the dates on the headstones in Henri Chapelle and Luxembourg American Cemetery. Thousands of dates read: December 1944, January 1945, February 1945, von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, von Manteuffel. They all said the same thing in those cold interrogation rooms. The war could have ended in 1944. It didn't, because political considerations overrode military logic. They told us what would have beaten them. They told us who should have led. They delivered their professional judgment without hesitation or malice. The question history asks is simple, yet it echoes with the ghosts of the fallen. Was anyone listening? Or were the voices of the dying drowned out by the arguments of the living?